Imagine this very room filled with grieving families, as we were only a day after the crash happened. Imagine sitting here for hours listening for the news of your loved ones, only to be told that there were shreds of remains of people and you shouldn't be going. A representative of the Polish Foreign Ministry stated that in fact only 10 people survived, but he did not go to the trouble of finding out who they were, so we had to proceed to wait for several more hours before he did so. It was only because the families forced him to do it, because they had access to internet and knew who were the individuals identified already. Understandably, this has caused so much distress that families couldn't travel to Moscow. Would they have travelled if the matters were handled differently? This callous approach to the families continued, and as you've seen already with the treatment of General Błaszczyk and other examples given. We don't have time to go through them all today, but let me just give you a couple of examples. The government spokesman justifying why the plane wreckage, one of the most critical pieces of evidence one would expect, had been left within 6 days unsecured, has simply said, it's not relevant to the investigation. How can it be? The same government spokesman decided first to apologize to the Russian soldiers without finding out the fact that they in fact have robbed the victims and then used their credit cards to go shopping with them. Why is it considered appropriate, human and not barbaric for the Russian investigation team to play live the tapes of our dying loved ones in a press conference when this has never ever happened in any other circumstance? Can you imagine the September 11th plane crashes and recordings being played to the media and how the families would have reacted to that? Yet for some reason it is acceptable for us to be subjected to that kind of treatment. It may be that human remains are not relevant to the investigation. I don't know. But why haven't they been simply collected from the crash site? All bodies were returned to Poland within 2 weeks. At the time, it seemed like a blessing to all our grieving families, a blessing that turned into a horror very, very quickly. Within weeks of the funerals, unidentified remains have arrived back in Poland. No one could explain why they were unidentified, despite the fact that everything was supposedly DNA tested. In the months after the funerals, many serious doubts have been cast over the identification process, as you've heard. This has been most distressing. Families simply do not know whether they buried their loved ones. The families, as you know, were not allowed to open their coffins. Even families that identified their loved ones in person now have concerns. Some families have ended up holding 3 separate funerals. Clothes that families took their loved ones to be buried in have been returned to them several months without any explanation. Things have become so desperate that, as you have heard, some families have now undergone exhumation. The first exhumation took 18 months after the crash, despite irrefutable evidence that it couldn't have been correct. Can you imagine 18 months for that particular family? Can you imagine what they've gone through? Just to be sure, just to have the evidence that should have been secured in the first place. You've heard about the 2 other autopsies that took place last week. The basic right of having your independent representative was refused with those. How can you subject a families to go through that ordeal second time round and refuse their rights to have someone present there? How can it be that 6 months after the crash, an archaeological team got sent to the crash site? I mean, it wouldn't expect to be the first choice for someone to gather evidence. How is it that this archaeological team found thousands of plane and body parts still at the crash site? How can it be that 23 months later, we are learning that personal belongings and plane parts of our loved ones are in a garage in Smolenska? Why are we excusing the fact that basic Interpol guidelines of victim disaster identification have not been followed, despite the fact that Russia is a member of Interpol? Why did we allow distraught members of families to be subjected to visual identification without preparation of each body and without further DNA confirmation? This meant that families spent much longer than necessary in Moscow, being asked to look at remains that were not their loved ones. I will never forget standing in the corridor in the center in Moscow on Monday, 12th of April, overlooking the hall to where the bodies were being held, and seeing one brave mother on her own repeatedly going through yet another remains so she could find her daughter. During the days we were in Moscow, she was not able to identify her. But when we saw her a week later, her first words were, "I found her." Why is it that visual identification has been accepted as primary identification, when generally accepted standards will tell you that it's only 70% accurate? Some families feel that the only way they will ever be able to believe that they buried their loved ones and that they're not in those 3 ambulances is for exhumation to take place for everybody. Yet how can families be expected to cope with that kind of ordeal yet again? Why is it considered acceptable for the families to be subjected to such ordeal and trauma simply because there has been no thorough or transparent process from the beginning? Why do we continue to allow it to happen? To conclude, on behalf of my family, and I'm sure other 10th of April families, we would like to take this opportunity to give our most heartfelt condolences to the families who lost their children and loved ones in the bus crash in Switzerland on 13th of March this year. We feel your pain and we understand it. We wish that you didn't have to go through this nightmare, and we pray that you're given the support and means to be able to somehow enjoy your tragedy. Thank you for your time today.